On the morning of April 14th, 1943, a German engineer named Werner stood at the edge of a concrete apron at Kummersdorf Proving Ground, 20 miles south of Berlin, staring at something that should not have existed. It was an American tank. An M4A1 Sherman, serial number USA 3067641. Cast hull, 75mm gun, olive drab paint still showing the desert dust of North Africa. Someone had chalked armor thickness measurements on every surface: front, sides, turret, mantlet, each number followed by the angle of the plate. The Germans had been thorough. They always were. But the numbers were not what stopped him. He climbed up onto the hull. The metal was cold under his palms. He lowered himself through the commander's hatch, feet finding the turret basket floor. And for a moment he just stood there in the fighting compartment, looking around. And that is when something changed. Not in the tank, in him. What this engineer saw inside that turret, what he touched, what he tested, what he wrote in his report, would quietly unravel everything the German Armored Corps believed about the enemy they were fighting. Not about American courage, not about American numbers, about something far more dangerous than either. This is that story. If the story of what Americans built and what it took to win matters to you, hit subscribe and the like button. It helps this channel reach the people who care. The Sherman sitting on the concrete at Kummersdorf had a name. The Americans had painted it on the hull in white block letters: War Daddy II. It belonged to Company G, 3rd Battalion, 1st Armored Regiment, 1st Armored Division of the United States Army. 8 weeks earlier, it had been fighting in Tunisia. To understand what that tank was doing in Germany, and why what the Germans found inside it mattered, you need to understand what happened at a place called Sidi Bouzid on February 14th, 1943, Valentine's Day. That morning, before dawn, sandstorms swept the plains of central Tunisia. Behind the wind, 2 German panzer divisions, the 10th and the 21st, came through the Faid and Maizila passes, aimed straight at the American positions around the village. The Americans had been in North Africa for barely 3 months. Most of them had never heard a tank gun fired in anger. The 1st Armored Division had trained in the California desert, run exercises with wooden markers representing enemy positions, and shipped out believing they were ready. They were not ready. By midday, 51 Shermans of the 3rd Battalion, 1st Armored Regiment rolled out to counterattack. They moved across open ground, in daylight, toward German positions they could not see. The 10th Panzer Division was waiting with Mark IV tanks, 88mm guns dug into the ridgeline, and Stukas overhead. The fight lasted hours. By nightfall, 44 of the 51 Shermans were burning or abandoned. Battalion Commander Colonel Hightower's own tank was destroyed. He walked back to division headquarters at Spatla on foot. Over the next 3 days, the disaster widened. The Americans lost nearly 1,600 men, 100 tanks, 57 half-tracks, and 29 artillery pieces. It was the worst defeat the United States Army would suffer in the European theater. The name attached to it, Kasserine Pass, would become shorthand for American failure. And in the wreckage, the Germans found something they had not expected. They found Shermans that were intact, not destroyed, abandoned. Crews had bailed out from fright or from minor damage that an experienced crew might have stayed to fight through. Green tankers, panicking under their first real fire, had left their machines behind with engines still warm and ammunition still loaded. A recon troop from Schwere Panzer Abteilung 501, a heavy Tiger battalion, found War Daddy II near Spatla on February 22nd. The tank was undamaged, fully operational. The crew was gone. The Germans did something they almost never did with captured Soviet T-34s. They did not strip it for parts. They did not modify it. Instead, someone painted on both sides of the hull, Nicht ausschlachten, bestimmt für OK8. Do not disassemble, reserved for high command. A German crew climbed in, started the engine, and drove it 350 kilometers to the port of Sfax. The journey took 4.5 days. And here is the detail you need to hold on to, because it will matter later. During that 350-kilometer drive, across unpaved Tunisian roads, in a tank built by a locomotive factory in Lima, Ohio, by men who had never built a tank before 1942, nothing broke. Not the engine, not the transmission, not the tracks. Not a single component failed. The German crew that drove it noticed. They did not yet understand what it meant. But at Kummersdorf, the engineers would. And what they wrote in their evaluation report would be one of the most quietly devastating documents to come out of the entire war. Not because it praised the Sherman, but because of what it revealed about Germany. Kummersdorf was not a place built for admiration. It was built for answers. The proving ground had been testing German weapons since the Kaiser's time. By 1943, it was the Reich's primary evaluation site for everything from V-weapons to captured enemy armor. The facility was methodical, clinical, and thorough. When War Daddy II arrived by rail from the port, the engineers assigned it Versuchsfahrzeug number 259, test vehicle 259, bolted on a Wehrmacht license plate, and went to work. They measured every surface. They fired rounds into spare armor plate of identical thickness and angle. They ran the engine on a dynamometer. They disassembled components, weighed them, sketched them, and compared them to their German equivalents. And the first thing they wrote in the report was a criticism. American manufacturing employs loose tolerances. They meant it as an indictment. German tank production, particularly at firms like MAN, Daimler-Benz, Henschel, operated on a philosophy inherited from generations of precision engineering. Every component was machined to exact specification. Gears were ground to thousandths of a millimeter. If a part did not meet tolerance, a skilled machinist filed it, adjusted it, fitted it by hand until it did. A German tank was, in a very real sense, a handcrafted object. Each one slightly different from the last. Each one requiring the specific parts made for that specific vehicle. The engineers at Kummersdorf looked at the Sherman's components and saw sloppiness, gaps where German parts would have none, surfaces that were smooth enough but not polished, fittings that were functional but not elegant. Then they tried something. They took a component from the Sherman, a road wheel assembly, and compared it to an identical assembly they had removed from a second captured Sherman, this one taken from a different American unit, built at a different factory, in a different month. The parts were not identical in the way German parts would be identical. The machining marks were different. The casting had slightly different grain. But the parts fit, perfectly, without filing, without adjustment, without a single tool beyond what a field mechanic would carry. They tried another component. And another. Turret fittings, engine mounts, transmission housings, track links. Every single part from one Sherman slid into position on the other Sherman, as though they had been made in the same room on the same afternoon. They had not been. One tank was built by Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio, the other by Pressed Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania. Two factories 600 kilometers apart, neither of which had ever manufactured a tank before the war, producing parts so standardized that a mechanic in a field workshop in Tunisia could pull a wrecked Sherman's transmission and bolt it into a different Sherman from a different factory, and drive away. Remember that, because what the Germans were looking at was not a tank. It was a manufacturing philosophy that their entire industrial system could not replicate. In Germany, if a Panther's final drive failed, and they failed constantly, you needed a replacement final drive made for that specific Panther from that specific production run, often from the same factory. If the part came from a different batch, a mechanic might spend hours with files and shims making it fit. If the right part was not available, and by 1944 it almost never was, the tank sat, and sat, and waited for a part that might never come. But the engineers at Kummersdorf were not finished. They kept opening panels. Behind the driver's seat, mounted low against the hull, they found a small gasoline engine connected to a generator. It was a Homelite auxiliary power unit, a single-cylinder, air-cooled motor no bigger than a bread box. It ran the tank's electrical system independently of the main engine. Turret traverse, radio, interior lighting, all operational without burning main fuel or announcing the tank's position with engine noise. And then there was the heat. The exhaust from the little Homelite was ducted into the crew compartment in cold weather. American tankers in the Ardennes, in the frozen fields of Lorraine, in the December fog of the Hürtgen forest, they had heating. Not much, but some. German tankers had nothing. A Panther crew in winter sat in a steel box at whatever temperature the air decided to be. If the engine was off, the inside of the turret was a freezer. If the engine was on, it consumed fuel they could not replace and broadcast their position to every listening post within a kilometer. The engineers noted the auxiliary generator in their report. They did not editorialize. They did not need to. Because here is what was becoming clear to the men at Kummersdorf, even if they could not yet say it plainly. The Americans had not built a better tank. The 75mm gun was adequate, not superior. The armor was acceptable, not exceptional. In a duel against a Panzer IV, the Sherman was roughly an even match. Against a Tiger, it was outgunned. But the Americans had built something the Germans could not match. A tank that was designed from the first bolt to be produced by the thousands, maintained by boys who had been fixing Chevrolets 6 months earlier, and kept running in conditions that would turn a Panther into an immobile pillbox. And on June 6, 1943, exactly 1 year before another June 6th that would change everything, War Daddy II was loaded onto a flatbed and driven to a place called Hillersleben. Albert Speer was waiting. So were the men who ran every armaments factory in the Reich. And what they were about to see would force them to confront a question none of them wanted to answer. Hillersleben was an artillery proving ground on the Kolbitz-Letzlinger Heath, northwest of Magdeburg. 27 kilometers of shooting range cut through deforested flatland. Concrete roads connected firing positions labeled Platz A through Platz I. Somewhere on the grounds sat a hull plate from a tank that weighed 120 tons, the Maus, a machine so absurd it would never see combat. This was where Germany tested what it believed was the future of war. On June 5, 1943, the day before the conference, Albert Speer and Joseph Goebbels stood before 10,000 armaments workers at the Berliner Sportpalast and delivered speeches about the miracle of German production. Speer presented statistics. Munitions output up 600% since 1941. Artillery fourfold. Tank deliveries at 1,250% of baseline. The crowd interrupted with applause. The numbers were staggering. They were also a lie. Every figure was expressed as a percentage, not in absolute units, because absolute numbers would have shown that Germany's output was still a fraction of what the Americans and Soviets were producing. Speer had chosen his baseline year carefully, a period in 41 when production had been at its lowest. He was comparing a recovering patient to a man in a coma and calling it a resurrection. After the speeches, Speer and the industry leaders boarded generator-powered buses and drove through the night to Hillersleben. The next morning, on the firing range, War Daddy II sat on the packed earth between German vehicles, rockets, heavy guns, a Panzerwerfer on a Maltier half-track. A propaganda camera crew was filming. And beside the Sherman, for the first time in public, sat a vehicle that most of the men present had never seen before. A Panther. Ausführung D, the very first production model. It had been built by MAN in Nuremberg, probably in April. It weighed 43 metric tons. It mounted the long-barreled 75mm KWK-42, one of the finest tank guns of the war. Its frontal armor was 80mm, sloped at 55 degrees. On paper, it was everything Germany needed to answer the Soviet T-34 and overmatch anything the Western Allies could field. The demonstration was simple. Both tanks would attempt to climb a steep, muddy slope. The Sherman went first. It churned uphill, tracks clawing at the soft loam, engine straining, and slid back. It could not make the grade. The camera crew filmed every second. Then the Panther went. 700 horsepower from the Maybach engine, wider tracks gripping the same slope. It climbed. It crested. The spectators, Reichsminister Speer, factory directors, senior Wehrmacht officers, watched the Panther conquer the hill that the American tank could not. The photographs went straight into Signal magazine. The captions were triumphant. General Sherman fell back, one read. His German contender, a new heavy tank, conquered the same obstacle. Tactical requirements and technical opportunities have been happily united in this mobile, heavily armored German colossus. That was the story Germany told itself in June of 1943. Now here is the story Germany did not tell. A week after the demonstration, Das Reich, one of the most widely read weekly newspapers in the country, published an article about the captured Sherman. The tone was not what you would expect from a propaganda organ reviewing an enemy weapon. The author called the Sherman one of the special accomplishments of the North American laboratories and described it as quite a praiseworthy product of the North American steel industry. Think about that sentence. A German propaganda newspaper in the middle of a war, in a country where defeatism could get you executed, publicly complimenting the enemy's tank. Not its gun, not its armor, its steel industry, its laboratories, the systems behind the machine. Someone, an engineer, an editor, perhaps someone who had read the Kummersdorf report, was trying to send a signal through the noise. The Sherman did not need to climb that hill. It did not need to outgun the Panther. What it needed to do, it had already done 350 kilometers of Tunisian road without a single breakdown, built by locomotive workers who learned tank production in months, with parts from a dozen factories that snapped together like children's blocks. And the Panther, the beautiful, powerful Panther that had just climbed the hill at Hillersleben, was about to prove exactly why that mattered. 5 weeks after Speer watched it crest that muddy slope, the Panther went to war. On July 5, 1943, 200 Panthers of the 51st and 52nd Panzer battalions rolled forward at Kursk in the largest tank battle in history. Within 24 hours, more than half were out of action. Not from Soviet guns, from mechanical failure. Fuel pumps leaked and caught fire, transmissions seized, final drives, the gearboxes that transferred power from the engine to the tracks, shattered under the tank's own weight. Crews abandoned vehicles in open fields because nothing could be done to fix them without factory-level equipment that did not exist within 500 kilometers. By the end of the first week, operational readiness in some Panther units had dropped to 16%. Out of every 6 Panthers that had rolled toward the front, 5 were sitting motionless somewhere behind the lines, waiting for parts that would not come, mechanics who were not trained, and tools that did not exist. Somewhere in Germany, War Daddy II sat in a shed at Kummersdorf. Its engine still ran. Its transmission still shifted. Every part still fit. And nobody in Berlin was talking about the hill anymore. Here is what most people misunderstand about tank combat in the Second World War. They think it was about armor thickness and gun caliber. Whose shell could punch through whose steel at what range? And those things mattered. But they were not what decided most engagements. What decided most engagements was who fired first. A study conducted by the US Army after the war found that in the majority of tank versus tank encounters in the European theater, the side that got the first round on target won the fight. Not the side with the bigger gun, not the side with the thicker armor. The side that saw the enemy, traversed the turret, and put steel on target before the other crew could do the same. And this is where something the engineers found inside War Daddy II stops being a technical detail and becomes a death sentence. Inside the Sherman's turret, bolted to a bracket on the right side, sat a compact hydraulic unit, the oil gear traverse system. It was powered by its own electric motor, which spun a hydraulic pump that could rotate the entire turret 360 degrees in 15 seconds. The gunner controlled it with a hand crank for fine adjustments and a power switch for fast slewing. If the commander spotted a target at 3 o'clock and the gun was pointed at 9, the gunner could be on target in under 8 seconds. Now picture a Panther crew in the same situation. The Ausführung D, the model at Hillersleben, the model at Kursk, had a turret traverse system driven by the main engine through a power takeoff. When the engine was idling, the traverse was agonizingly slow. One full rotation took 60 seconds. If the Panther's engine was off, as it often was in ambush positions to conserve fuel, the crew had only a hand wheel, no power traverse at all. The later Ausführung A improved this. They got the full rotation down to about 15 seconds at combat engine speed. But then Germany ran out of the raw materials needed for the electrical system, and in the final production variant of the Panzer IV, the Ausführung J, which rolled off the lines in 1944, they deleted the powered turret traverse entirely. The most produced German medium tank ended the war with its crew hand-cranking the turret like it was 1932. But the Sherman had something else the Germans had never seen in any tank. Something mounted to the turret alongside the traverse motor that the Kummersdorf engineers examined, sketched, and could not quite believe. A gyroscopic stabilizer. Built by Westinghouse, it used a spinning gyroscope and hydraulic actuators to hold the gun steady in the vertical plane while the tank was moving. It did not aim the gun. It did not replace the gunner's skill. What it did was keep the barrel from bouncing with every bump and dip in the terrain, so that when the tank stopped, the gun was already close to level. The gunner needed only a small correction, not a full re-aim from a wildly pitching barrel. In practical terms, a Sherman coming to a halt could fire an aimed round within seconds. A Panther coming to a halt needed the gunner to wrestle the long, heavy 75mm barrel back onto target, fighting the momentum of the stop, compensating for the bounce. The difference was measured in seconds. In a tank engagement, seconds were lives. Not every American crew used the stabilizer. It was complex. It required training, and many crews in the rush of deployment never learned to trust it. But the crews who did had an edge that German tankers could not explain. After-action reports from the Western Front repeatedly noted that Shermans seemed to fire first, even when the German crew had spotted them at the same time or earlier. A Tiger commander could be sitting in a perfect ambush position, concealed, waiting, engine idling, spot a Sherman at 800 meters, order his gunner to traverse, and fire the first round. If he missed, and the 88 missed more often than the legend suggests, the Sherman's turret was already spinning. The American gunner had the target. Power traverse put him online. The stabilizer had held his barrel close to level during the approach. He fired. And then he fired again. And again. 3 or 4 rounds in the time it took the Tiger crew to reload and re-aim once. This is what the Kummersdorf report meant when it noted the Sherman's fire control systems. The engineers understood the components. What they could not replicate was the industrial base that produced gyroscopes precise enough to stabilize a gun barrel in a 30-ton vehicle moving over broken ground, and produced them by the thousands. One for every Sherman that rolled off every assembly line in the country. Germany could build a handful of exquisite prototypes. Germany could not build 10,000 gyroscopes. And this was still not the deepest layer, because everything the engineers had found so far, the interchangeable parts, the hydraulic traverse, the stabilizer, the auxiliary generator, All of it pointed to a single idea that the German system had no answer for. Not a better tank, a better way to keep tanks fighting. The Americans had built something that went far beyond what sat on the proving ground at Kummersdorf. They had built a repair and supply system so fast, so standardized, so ruthlessly efficient that a Sherman knocked out on Monday could be back in the line by Wednesday, while a Panther knocked out on Monday might still be sitting in a field in April. And by the summer of 1944, that system was about to cross the English Channel. On the 5th of June, 1944, the day before the largest amphibious invasion in history, a fleet of ships sat in the English Channel carrying something that no army had ever attempted to deliver under fire on a hostile beach. Not tanks, spare parts. More than 50,000 individual Sherman components had been crated, cataloged, and loaded onto transport vessels. Road wheels, track links, transmission assemblies, engine blocks, turret rings, periscope heads, hydraulic lines for the traverse system, gyroscope units for the stabilizer. Every part stamped with a federal stock number that matched every other part with the same number, regardless of which factory had made it. Chrysler in Detroit, Fisher Body in Grand Blanc, Lima Locomotive in Ohio, Pressed Steel Car in Pennsylvania, or any of the other 11 plants producing Shermans across the country. Behind the transports carrying the parts came something even more unusual: floating repair depots. Welding equipment, machine lathes, engine hoists, all mounted on vessels that would anchor offshore and begin processing damaged vehicles within hours of the first wave hitting the sand. This was not improvisation. This was doctrine. The United States Army had designed a 5-tier repair system, they called them echelons, that started at the crew level and scaled up to full factory-grade overhaul. First echelon, the crew themselves, fixing what they could with the tools stowed in the tank. Second echelon, the company maintenance section, working in the field with slightly heavier equipment. Third echelon, battalion and regimental shops, capable of swapping major assemblies, engines, transmissions, final drives. Fourth echelon, division-level repair depots with overhead cranes, machine tools, and the ability to perform work that in Germany would require shipping a tank back to the factory. Fifth echelon, rear area rebuild facilities that could take a hull scorched black by fire and return it to service as a functioning tank. And here's the detail that made the whole system possible. The same detail the Kummersdorf engineers had noted with disdain in their report on War Daddy II. Interchangeable parts. A Sherman destroyed by a Panzerfaust in the hedgerows of Normandy could donate its turret to a Sherman that had thrown a track and been hit in the hull by an anti-tank round. The turret from the first, built by Fisher Body in Michigan, would bolt directly onto the hull of the second, built by Chrysler in Detroit, with no modification, no filing, no fitting, no specialist required. From 2 dead tanks, 1 living tank, ready to fight in 24 to 48 hours. The Germans could not do this. Not because they lacked skill. German mechanics were superb, arguably the best trained in the world. But because every German tank was, at some level, unique. A transmission housing from a Panther built at MAN in January did not precisely match a Panther built at Daimler-Benz in March. A final drive from one Tiger might require hours of hand fitting to work in another Tiger from a different production run. And a Panther part would never, under any circumstances, fit a Panzer IV or a Tiger. 3 completely different vehicles, 3 completely different supply chains, competing for the same shrinking pool of raw materials, skilled labor, and factory floor space. Imagine a German maintenance officer in Normandy in July of 1944. He has 14 Panthers in his battalion. 6 are operational. 5 are waiting for final drives that have not arrived from Germany. 2 need transmissions, and replacing a Panther transmission required removing the entire upper hull and driver's compartment, a job that took a specialized crew with a crane the better part of a day in a rear area safe from air attack. One has an engine fire. He has no spare engines. He has sent 4 requests up the chain of command. The roads behind him are being bombed around the clock by American fighter bombers. Now imagine his American counterpart. He has 30 Shermans in his battalion. 26 are operational. 2 were knocked out yesterday. 1 is already back. The maintenance section pulled the damaged transmission in 6 hours, bolted in a replacement from the spare parts truck, and the tank drove back to the line before dawn. The other needs a new turret basket and gun mount, 4th echelon work. It will be back in 2 days. By August of 1944, 2 months after the invasion, American armored units in France were running at roughly 85% operational readiness. 85% of their tanks were running, armed, and ready to fight on any given day. German panzer divisions had dropped to 50% and falling. Not because the Americans were not losing tanks. They were losing them at ferocious rates, in the hedgerows, in the bocage fighting, in the open fields south of Caen. But the system behind them was replacing and repairing faster than the Germans could destroy. A Sherman burned out on Tuesday could be a rebuilt Sherman on Friday. A Panther burned out on Tuesday was scrap metal. And the men who suffered most from this arithmetic were not the generals reading reports in Berlin. They were the German tankers sitting in their vehicles, watching the numbers change day by day. Fewer Panthers in the morning assembly, fewer still by evening. The maintenance tents empty because there was nothing to maintain with. While across the hedgerow, the Americans seemed to have just as many Shermans as yesterday, maybe more. Those tankers were about to get a chance to understand why. Because in the winter of 1944, as Germany launched its last great gamble in the West, German crews would climb inside captured Shermans for the first time, not as engineers studying a curiosity, but as soldiers fighting for survival. On the night of January 16, 1945, Obersturmführer Erwin Bachmann sat in the sidecar of a motorcycle on a frozen road outside the Alsatian village of Herlesheim, France. He was 23 years old. He had been fighting since Poland in 1939, 6 years, 4 fronts, more tanks than he could count destroyed or abandoned under him. He was the battalion adjutant of the 1st Battalion, 10th SS Panzer Regiment, Frundsberg Division. He had 4 operational Panther tanks. 4. That was his entire armored force for the night's attack. Operation Nordwind, Germany's last offensive in the West, had been grinding forward for 2 weeks, trying to break through American lines in Alsace while the Ardennes offensive bled out to the north. Fuel was scarce. Replacement vehicles were non-existent. Bachmann's regiment had started the war with over 100 tanks. Now he was planning an assault on an American-held village with 4. He did not know what was waiting inside Herlesheim, but a patrol had reported American armor in the streets, tanks from the 43rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division. How many, the patrol could not say. Before dawn on January 17th, Bachmann led 2 of his Panthers into the village from the south. The streets were narrow, the buildings close. He positioned the 2 tanks at a crossroads and set up Panzerfaust teams in the doorways. Then he waited. The first Shermans came around a corner at close range. Bachmann's Panthers opened fire. 2 Shermans burst into flames. Then a third. The American column, caught in the tight streets with no room to maneuver, stalled. Bachmann dismounted from his motorcycle, picked up a Panzerfaust, and personally destroyed a 4th Sherman at point-blank range. In the chaos that followed, the American tankers, many of them green replacements who had been in France for less than a month, found themselves surrounded, cut off from their battalion, low on ammunition, unable to back out of the narrow streets. 60 American soldiers surrendered. 20 German prisoners held in the village were freed and rearmed, and 12 Shermans, 12 M4A3 75mm tanks, fully armed, fully fueled, undamaged, were captured intact. Their crews had climbed out with their hands up. The tanks sat in the street with engines idling. What happened next is the moment this story has been building toward. Bachmann's men, Panther crews, tankers who had trained on German vehicles, who had lived inside German steel for years, climbed into the Shermans. They had to fight them immediately, drive them back the German lines before American artillery found the range. There was no time for manuals, no time for instruction. They sat in the driver's seat, put their hands on the controls, and discovered what the Kummersdorf engineers had written about 2 years earlier. The transmission had synchromesh on 4 of 5 gears, no double clutching. The stick moved like an automobile gear shift, slot to slot, smooth, predictable. A Panther's transmission was powerful, but demanded technique. Miss a shift under stress, and you could strip the gears or stall the engine. The Sherman forgave. A 20-year-old who had driven a delivery truck before the war could drive this tank in 10 minutes. The turret. They reached for the traverse control. The turret swung. Fast, smooth, electric hydraulic, the whole mass of gun and mantlet and armor spinning on the ring like it weighed nothing. Their Panther's traverse was good when the engine was running at combat speed. The Sherman's traverse was good always, even on the auxiliary generator, even with the main engine off. The seats, padded, adjustable. The fighting compartment was tall enough that the loader could stand and work without crouching. The periscopes gave wide-angle views. The instruments were labeled clearly, logically, as though someone had asked a crew what they needed to see and then put it exactly there. And the engine started. Every time. The first time. In the January cold, on a frozen street in Alsace, an engine built by Ford in Michigan, the GAA V8, 500 horsepower, dual overhead cams, no belts, no chains, everything gear-driven, turned over and caught without hesitation. Bachmann's men drove the 12 Shermans back to Offendorf. They radioed ahead to make sure their own side did not fire on them. American silhouettes in German hands. The tanks arrived intact, every one of them. 350 kilometers of Tunisian road in 1943. A frozen nighttime drive through Alsatian villages in 1945. The Sherman did not care where it was or who was driving it. It ran. The 12 captured tanks were formed into the 13th Company of the 10th SS Panzer Regiment. German crosses were painted over the white stars. No other modifications were made. None were needed. And here is the fact that tells the whole story. German tank units that captured Shermans never modified them. They never upgraded the armor, never changed the turret, never replaced the gun with a German weapon. They used them exactly as the Americans had built them. When they captured Soviet T-34s, they often modified them, added German cupolas, changed radio equipment, adapted the fittings. With the Sherman, they changed nothing, because there was nothing to fix. 6 days after Bachmann's men captured those 12 Shermans, 6 days, the men who ran Germany's entire armored production gathered for a meeting that would lay bare just how deep the crisis went. And the words spoken in that room are among the most quietly devastating of the war. January 23rd, 1945. 6 days after Herlesheim. A conference room, somewhere in the German military bureaucracy. The men gathered around the table were the Panzer Commission, senior officers, engineers, and industrial representatives responsible for every armored vehicle Germany produced. General Wolfgang Tomale opened with a report from the front. He did not soften it. From the front, there continues to be serious complaints regarding final drive breakdowns in all vehicle types. He read the numbers. 500 defective final drives on the Panzer IV. The workhorse. The tank that had been in service since 1939. The one vehicle they were supposed to have mastered. 370 defective final drives on the Panther. The tank that was going to win the war. The answer to the T-34. The machine that had climbed the hill at Hillesleben while the Sherman slid back. Roughly 100 defective final drives on the Tiger. Nearly 1,000 tanks, sitting in fields, in repair depots, on roadsides. Not because the enemy had destroyed them, but because the gears inside their own drivetrains had chewed themselves apart. Tomala said something that no German general had ever said this plainly in an official meeting. In such circumstances, an orderly utilization of tanks is simply impossible. Then he added the sentence that the Kummersdorf engineers could have written 2 years earlier, if anyone had been willing to hear it. The troops lose their confidence and in some situations abandon the whole vehicle just because of this problem. Abandon. Not because of enemy fire, not because of fuel shortage, because the crews no longer believed their own tanks would move when they needed them to. Think about what that means for a tanker. You are sitting inside 43 tons of steel in a frozen field in East Prussia. You can hear Soviet artillery walking closer. You press the ignition. The Maybach engine turns over. Maybe. You put the tank in gear. The transmission engages. You release the clutch, apply throttle, and the tank lurches forward. And then something inside the final drive housing makes a sound like a bag of hammers thrown into a cement mixer. And the tank stops. Dead. You and your crew are now sitting in an immobile steel box with Soviet shells falling around you. You do not have the parts to fix it. You do not have a recovery vehicle to tow it. You have 2 choices: stay and die, or climb out and run. German tankers were climbing out and running, not from the enemy, from their own machines. Now hold that image and set it beside this one. 6 days earlier, at Herlesheim, Bachmann's men sitting inside 12 captured Shermans. Engines that start, transmissions that shift, final drives that do not shatter, turrets that traverse. A tank that does what you tell it to do, every time, without negotiation. The Panzer Commission knew the numbers. Germany had produced roughly 6,000 Panthers since 1943. Fewer than 1,400 Tigers of both types combined. About 8,000 Panzer IVs still in various stages of serviceability. The Americans, in the same period, had produced over 49,000 Shermans. 49,000! From 11 different factories, many of which had been building locomotives, car bodies, and steel rail cars 3 years earlier. But the number was not the worst part. Germany could have accepted being outproduced. What it could not accept, what the Panzer Commission was now confronting in that room, was that the American tanks worked, and the German tanks did not. A Sherman's final drive used herringbone gears, angled teeth that distributed load evenly, reduced stress, and lasted thousands of kilometers without failure. Restoration crews working on Shermans decades after the war have pulled final drives from tanks that sat in fields for 40 years and found them still mechanically sound. No corrosion in the gear teeth, no play in the bearings. The Sherman's final drive gear ratio of 2.84 to 1 had been engineered with so much margin that the entire drivetrain could absorb the weight increases of later models, up-armored jumbos, 76mm gun variants, without modification. A Panther's final drive had 75 gear teeth, where the Tigers had 209. The engineering stress on each individual tooth was more than 5 times greater. The gears were made from chromoly steel, when Germany could get molybdenum, which by 44 it often could not. The French army, which inherited 100 Panthers after the war and operated them until 1949, documented that the final drive had an average fatigue life of 150 kilometers under combat stress. 150. A Sherman could cross most of France on a single set of final drives. A Panther could barely make it from one French village to the next. And there was no fixing it. Not with better steel. Germany had reached the metallurgical limits available to it. Not with more teeth. The housing was too small. Not with a new design. There was no time, no factory capacity, no engineering bandwidth. The Panther's final drive was a problem baked into the vehicle's DNA, and no amount of German precision could engineer a way out. The Shermans' loose tolerances, the sloppiness that the Kummersdorf engineers had noted with such disdain in their 1943 report, had been the right answer all along. Build with margin. Build for forgiveness. Build so that a farm boy from Iowa can fix it with a wrench and a manual, because the alternative is a master machinist who is already dead on the Eastern Front. Somewhere in Alsace, the 13th Company of the 10th SS Panzer Regiment was still fighting in its 12 captured Shermans. And every morning, those tanks started. In the last week of April 1945, Soviet tanks reached the outskirts of Kummersdorf. The proving ground where War Daddy II had been measured, tested, and catalogued 2 years earlier was now in the path of the Red Army's final drive toward Berlin. The facility that had tested the Mouse, the Panther, the Tiger, the V weapons, and one olive-drab Sherman from Ohio was about to become a footnote in someone else's victory. In the chaos of those final days, the Germans had scraped together a unit they called Panzerkompanie Kummersdorf, a tank company assembled from whatever still moved on the proving ground. It was a museum of desperation. One Tiger II, one Jagdtiger, several Borgward remote-controlled demolition carriers mounted with machine guns, an Italian heavy tank that had no business being on a German battlefield, and 2 American Shermans. The same machines that had arrived as curiosities, as objects to be studied, measured, and dismissed, were now the last line of defense. German crews climbed into American tanks to fight Soviet tanks on German soil. The war had begun with panzers rolling through Poland in disciplined columns. It ended with a locomotive company's tank from Lima, Ohio, guarding a proving ground south of Berlin. War Daddy II's exact fate is not recorded. It may have been one of the 2 Shermans in that final company. It may have been destroyed in the Soviet advance. It may have been buried in rubble when the Red Army shelled the facility. What is certain is that it never went home. Erwin Bachmann, the 23-year-old who captured 12 Shermans at Herlesheim with 2 Panthers and a Panzerfaust, survived the war. His 13th Company fought with those captured American tanks through the retreat across the Rhine, through Pomerania, all the way to the final days. They never ran out of ammunition for the 75mm guns because the advancing Americans left enough behind. In May of 1945, near Göttingen, Bachmann and what was left of his men drove west and surrendered to the British. He went home. He lived quietly. He died on February 18, 2010, and was buried in Göttingen. He was 88 years old. The Chrysler Detroit Arsenal, the purpose-built factory that produced more Shermans than any other facility in the country, kept building tanks after the war. M26 Pershings, M47 Pattons, M48s, M60s, eventually M1 Abrams. The factory that K.T. Keller built for $5 a year in executive salary lived into the 1990s before Chrysler Defense Systems was sold to General Dynamics. The assembly line never really stopped. Fisher Body in Grand Blanc, Michigan, produced 11,385 Shermans between 42 and 45. After the war, the plant went back to making car bodies. The workers who had built tanks went back to building Buicks. The skills were the same. That was the point. That had always been the point. Lima Locomotive Works, the company that built War Daddy II, had been making train engines since 1870. They made Shermans for 18 months, turned out 1,655 of them, and went back to locomotives. A factory that had never seen a tank before 1942 produced machines so well built that German engineers across the ocean were writing reports about them in language that read like a confession. And here is where the story comes to rest. What stunned German tankers inside captured American Shermans was not the armor. It was not the gun. It was not any single component that a German engineer could point to and say, "This is better than what we build." What stunned them was the ordinary things. A part that fit without filing, a gear that shifted without force, a turret that moved when you told it to, an engine that started in the cold, a generator that gave you heat when everything outside was frozen, a tank built by locomotive workers and car mechanics 6,000 miles away that worked, simply, reliably, every single time, while their own tanks, built by the finest precision engineers in Europe, fell apart under their hands. That was the verdict. Not spoken in a conference room or written in a formal report, but felt in the fingers of a German mechanic who picked up a Sherman road wheel and watched it slide into place without resistance. In the hands of a driver at Herlesheim who put the Sherman in gear and felt the synchro mesh catch like a Sunday drive. In the silence of a Panther crew sitting in a dead tank in a frozen field, knowing that across the line, every American tank was running. The Americans did not build the best tank of the Second World War. They built the best system. And the men inside the captured Shermans were the first to understand what that meant. Not as a statistic, not as a production chart, but as the feeling of a machine that worked, built by a country that had figured out something Germany never could: how to make 50,000 of anything, and make every single one of them right. Thank you for staying with this story for the last hour. If it moved you, or taught you something you did not know, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of deep history matters, and it helps these stories reach the people who want to find them. If you are not subscribed yet, I would be honored if you joined us. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new investigation. I would love to know, where are you watching from today? And if someone in your family fought for the Allied cause in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, a great uncle who helped build that victory, tell me about them in the comments. Their service deserves to be remembered.